The faithful love of the Lord never ends, his mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance, therefore I will hope in him. I love this passage. I think it's beautiful and it's powerful, and I find it really encouraging. It speaks to us of God's faithfulness, of God's mercy, of God's character. It tells us we can place our hope in him and that we find our inheritance in him. In fact, he is our inheritance. There's so much amazing stuff in this passage. But I also find that when times are tough as they are right now, when things don't seem to be going the way that we'd expect, they don't seem to be going the way that we think God would want them to go for us, that it's quite hard to read a passage like this. That it just seems like flowery encouragement. Maybe it doesn't even seem real. However, when we look at the story behind this passage, the author who wrote it and the situation he was in, it's really encouraging. So we think Jeremiah wrote it, but whoever wrote it, we know that they were writing after the destruction of Jerusalem in about 586 BC. The whole book, Lamentations, is a lament. It's a mourning at the state of Jerusalem, at the destruction, and it's actually a pretty brutal and visceral and also personal account of just how grim that time was. And it's in the middle of that we find this message of hope. In fact, just before the part I've quoted, they wrote, "The thought of my suffering and homelessness is bitter beyond words. I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss." So what changes? How is it that they can experience such loss, such grief, that they're left broken, homeless, bitter, and yet they have this hope in God, and they're expressing this wonderful hope and belief in God's faithfulness and God's character and his mercy? What changes between those two verses? Well, there's a tiny little verse in between, and all it says is, "Yet I still dare to hope when I remember this." And I think there's a real power there in that word, remember. It shows that the author's hope is not an optimistic hope, a hope that goes, oh yeah, I'd really like it if God turned out to be good after all. It's not a hope of optimism that's just like, yeah, really, really, really be good if. It's not an if hope at all. It's a certain hope because he remembers that God is good, that God is faithful, that God is merciful. And I think that's really awesome, because it shows us this is not some wishy-washy, nice ideal being shown to us by someone who's having an easy life, but someone who was suffering, someone who couldn't see goodness around him when he looked around, could remember that God was good, and in that he had hope. And I think that's really encouraging at this time. He goes on to say, "The Lord is good to those who depend on him, to those who search for him, so it is good to wait quietly for salvation from the Lord." And again, I'm really encouraged that the hope isn't just a nice idea, a nice feeling, but it leads him to do something. It leads him to commit to looking for God, to waiting for God. And I think in this, he shows us a really good example of how we respond in the current crisis and current pandemic. That he starts off with honesty, that he looks at the situation and he is honest about how grim and upsetting and devastating it is. He's not pretending, it'll be okay, it's not as bad as it looks. But he looks at it face on and goes, this is horrible. This makes my soul and my heart grieve. But he doesn't stop there. In the midst of that, he's remembering who God is. He's remembering God's goodness, which brings him hope. And then that hope leads to a change in what he's doing. It leads to him seeking and searching for God, waiting quietly for God. And I think that's a really good model for us. It's a really good way to respond in a world that's currently responding in every extreme, from hoarding everything, hoarding the loo roll, hoarding the pasta, doing everything possible to try and save themselves, through to those that are going, yeah, it's not really anything, it's fine, and pretending that it's not the crisis that it is. I think this shows us a really good middle option of accepting the reality of it, but not accepting that that's everything, accepting that God is still good in the midst of all our suffering. And I think that doesn't change the nature of COVID-19. It doesn't grant us immunity to it. It doesn't mean that this won't all drag on for many more months. But what it does do is it changes how we respond in those months, how we act. Jesus said, "You are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house." Now, you might be thinking, but our churches are closed. We can't go out on mission. It feels like we've been told to put baskets on our lamps and we can't do much about it. But I've noticed just over these last couple of weeks that people are communicating more, not less. That actually friends who haven't been in contact in 6 months are checking in on each other when they wouldn't normally do that under normal circumstances. There's this sudden burst of communication and conversation in this situation, and I think we're in a really privileged position as Christians to be able to look honestly at the suffering and go, there is still real hope, and his name's Jesus. And I think we've got a real opportunity to show people Jesus in a new way that's not showing them platitudes and churchiness, but showing that we have real hope in the middle of all of this. And I think I want to end on some other words of Jesus that just give me so much encouragement. "Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart, because I have overcome the world."